So each year, the season of creation has a particular theme or focus. And the one that's been chosen for this year is Jubilee, a rest for the earth. And hence the second reading we just heard from Leviticus, which is a book that we don't often get into, but it has some interesting material in it, including this idea of a Jubilee year. Every 50 years, the Israelites were called to, if you like, go back to their home patch of ground, and any transactions of land that have been made reverted back to their original owners, debts were cancelled, slaves were freed, and the earth was to be given a year's rest as well. And that's following the pattern of creation, that God rested on the seventh day. So we have this idea of Jubilee. We're not sure if the Israelites followed it, but it's there in our scriptures. There's also the reminder at the very end of that Leviticus reading that we don't actually own the land. It's not ours to just have and use as we will. It's actually God's land, and we're tenants. And that's much closer to the Indigenous way of understanding the relationship to the land, that they are custodians, they are tenants of the land, there to care for it. So in some ways, you might be thinking that one of the unexpected side effects, one of the unintended benefits of the COVID pandemic across the world is that it's actually giving the earth a rest. We're no longer flying planes here, there and everywhere. We're no longer driving nearly as much. And so in some ways, the earth is having a rest. You only have to go outside and see how quiet the streets are. And perhaps because of that quietness, we're noticing more of the birds, for instance, and their calls and so forth. So in some ways, the earth is having a rest. But in other ways, it's business as usual. And people who monitor these things, like carbon emissions across the world, have noted that, yes, they've dropped, but not by as much as you might think. They've gone down in Australia, for instance, by around 8% this year compared to normal. But that still means we're carrying on 92% of our normal activities. The pandemic, of course, has also highlighted the injustices and the inequities that exist in our society and in our culture. And the pandemic has hit poor people much harder than rich people. And you might think, well, why is that? And it's because rich people have the privilege, I guess, of staying at home and isolating and working from home. And poorer people, as we've discovered, a lot of those who work in aged care don't have that privilege. First of all, they must be at work, and they often must work multiple jobs to make ends meet. We've had a period during the pandemic of a moratorium on rental and mortgages, and that's helped people stay in their own homes. But that is coming to an end soon too, and we're not sure what's going to happen. But we're a long way from the Jubilee idea of cancelling debts and wiping them out. So are we in the middle of a Jubilee year for the earth? Well, kind of, depending how you look at it. But in other ways, no. The focus for this week in particular is on forests. And I don't know about you, but I love forests. I always have done since I was a child, and we went on holidays, and usually it involved going for lots of walks in forests. Later on, when I took up bushwalking, again, lots of walking through beautiful forests in different parts of Australia and elsewhere. And I'm sure many of you have a similar love for forests. And it might be the inspiring nature of tall trees. It might be the diversity of life that exists in a forest. All of the plants, all of the animals, all of the other creatures that are in a forest. There's the beauty in a forest. But there's also, I think, something more primal that somehow we remember that when humanity was created, we were created to live in a forest, in a garden, in Eden. And perhaps that's one of the reasons why when we visit forests, they can feel very spiritual, that it's a place where we can feel close to God and connect with God. And of course, in God's wisdom, so much of creation is interdependent. And scientists will tell us now that humanity, animals, and forests work together. We breathe out carbon dioxide and need to breathe in oxygen, while forests and plants do the opposite. They breathe in the CO2 and give out oxygen. So in some ways, the forests are like the lungs of the planet. They absorb lots of the carbon dioxide. There's more to this interdependence as well. The reading from Genesis 2 that we heard suggests that we rely on plants and trees to live. And if you think about our food, basically all our food comes from plants. Even if sometimes we eat meat and other animal-based foods, that in turn relies on plants to grow. So we're completely dependent on plants and trees for our life and the food that we eat. But the reading suggests there's an interdependence between ourselves and plants as well. And that interdependence is that we are called to cultivate the earth, yes, but to care for it. And the Hebrew word care there can also mean to protect or to watch over. It almost has the idea of nurture, that we're called to nurture and care for the earth, to protect it, just like it protects us and feeds us. And perhaps there's an important lesson for us if we think about forests and how we treat forests from our Indigenous brothers and sisters, because they have this strong view that the natural world is there to support us, and it's not to be exploited. It's to be cared for so that it in turn can sustain us. And so Indigenous people will never kill off whole populations. They will never allow huge fires to get out of control. They're much more in keeping with the seasons of creation, perhaps, than we are. And so there are lessons to be learned from our Indigenous brothers and sisters. Western cultures, European cultures, of course, have a somewhat different attitude towards forests. And we've seen forests generally as a resource to be plundered, a resource to be cut down and used for profit. And it's been going on for decades and centuries. And it's still going on. So that in places like the Amazon, you will have probably read about. Huge tracts of forest are being cut down every day. But it's not just in the Amazon, and it's not just in Indonesia and Malaysia. It's going on at a very rapid rate here in Australia as well. And for those of you who might have had a chance to see the programs on ABC TV recently, Fight for Planet A. And if you haven't seen those, try and get hold of them on iView. They're very insightful. And in these programs, Craig Rucastle talks about how much land clearing is going on in Australia right now. And what is the purpose of all this land clearing going on across the world? Well, generally it's to enable growing of certain crops and certain feedstocks, especially for animals and for cattle, to grow soybeans and other feed for cattle. It's to grow palm oil to be made into things like chocolate and margarine. It's to grow oranges in the Amazon for our orange juice, because most of our orange juice is reconstituted from frozen juice that comes from, guess where? Brazil. It's to grow things like coffee and cocoa. So we're madly chopping down forests every day so that we can have things like beef and chocolate and coffee and orange juice. And you think, wow, we're destroying the natural order of things that God created just so that we can consume and eat and drink more of those things. So there's a problem there that as a whole society, we need to really stop and reflect what we're doing, because these forests, once they're gone, and they won't ever come back. But there's another problem that the forests are facing as well. And this is the inconvenient truth of climate change. And our climate is getting warmer and drier. And we see the effects of that in different parts of the world and here in Australia. We spent a season of our lives living over in Perth in Western Australia and enjoyed the opportunity to travel around the southwest corner of WA, where there are magnificent forests. Those forests are changing and dying as the Western Australian climate heats up and there is less rainfall. We all saw last summer the devastating effects of the bushfires on the east coast of Australia that were probably the worst ever that we've known. Just wildfires completely out of control. And despite our federal government's reluctance to link those fires with climate change, because of the rhetoric that says, well, Australia's always had fires and droughts and floods, it's just where we are. But the fires last summer were something else. They were way bigger, way more intense, caused way more damage than previous fires. And I did just a little bit of research during the week as to the effect of those fires. And we know the sort of headline messages that 30 odd people died in the fires, many of them fighting them. 3,000 homes were destroyed. And that's tragic for those people and those families. But we don't often stop to think how much forest was burned. And when you look at the numbers of how much forest was burned, the area consumed was 3 times the size of Tasmania, or roughly 1.5 times the size of England. It was a vast area of forest that burned. So millions and millions and millions of trees and other plants burned. But it's not just the trees. It's estimated that between 1 billion and 3 billion animals and birds perished in the fires as well. It's just mind-boggling to think about. And many of those species may not come back. They may now be extinct forever. And we think, well, that's too bad perhaps, but it's us through our actions and in some ways our selfishness as a species destroying the earth. Climate change is also destroying things like the Great Barrier Reef. We've had 3 bleaching events in the last 5 years. Estimates are that within 5 or 10 years, we may lose all the corals everywhere in the world. And that is such a sad, sad outcome. And you think of the diversity of life that's in a coral reef, and to think that we may lose all of that. And that's down to our attitudes and our actions as humans. We're the ones that are causing it. So I guess one of the urgent questions that a focus on creation puts right before us is, what are we going to do about it? What is our response going to be? Are we going to listen to the climate scientists who for 40 or 50 years have been warning us of the effects of climate change that we're now seeing undeniably happening in our world? Perhaps one of the good things about the COVID pandemic is that we have learned to once again listen to the scientists, to take their advice seriously and to take action based on their advice. And, dare I say it, be prepared to pay the price for making changes to how we live. It hasn't been a case, as it is with climate change, to say, well, now I live in the eastern suburbs of Melbourne and there's not much COVID happening here, so I don't have to worry about the people living in the northern and western suburbs. I can just go out and enjoy myself and catch up with my friends and, you know, go to the pub. No, there are restrictions on all of us if we're to beat the coronavirus. And likewise, if we're to do something about climate change and actually start respecting the earth and respecting other creatures, then we've got to all act collectively. And it's going to require some pretty major change. And that's a huge, complex topic, and it's far more than we can look at today. But again, if you haven't seen those programs on the ABC, Fight for Planet A, they're worth having a look because they offer numerous examples and illustrations of simple changes that we can make in the way we live that actually have a big impact on the natural world. And so there's something that all of us can do. Perhaps there's multiple things that all of us can do. So in this first week of our focus on season of creation, I think one of the main points that has been impressed on me as I've thought and reflected this week is for all of us to realise that we are just a part of creation. We don't sit above and aloof from creation. We are in fact part of creation. And if we do destroy our forests, if we do destroy our coral reefs, if we do allow climate change to go on unchecked and we have worse and more bushfires every year and worse and longer droughts, then it's going to affect us, and it is already affecting us. So we need to think about what is our part and what changes might we need to make to honour the rest of creation and to live in harmony and in partnership and interdependence with the rest of creation. And we'll be thinking some more about that over the next few weeks. Amen.